Welcome to I Believe, where we talk about governance and philosophy in America. I'm Joel Douglas, and I believe in America. Thanks for joining me. Why do we spend so much on defense? Opening scene, Key West, 1948.
It's March 1948, and the tropical heat of Key West, Florida, presses against a group of men in khaki uniforms and dark blue service caps. They sit around a long table in what was once a naval officers' club, now repurposed for one of the most important meetings in U.S. military history. This is where the fate of America's post-World War II military structure is being decided in a meeting known as the Key West Agreement. Before this meeting, President Harry S. Truman had signed the National Security Act of 1947 into law. It came into effect on September 18, 1947. Among other directives, the act created the Air Force, separated the Marine Corps as its own service, and merged the Army, Navy, Marine Corps, and Air Force into one big, happy Department of Defense family. Except they were all unhappy. At the head of the table sat the first-ever Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. He was tasked with bringing order to the growing tensions between the military services. There's no official transcript of this meeting, but Forrestal's message was clear. He wasn't here to debate, he was here to decide.
Gentlemen, this nation cannot afford inefficiency in its military forces. The roles and missions of each service must be clearly defined, or we risk wasting taxpayer dollars on duplicative efforts. The President expects solutions today, not another fight over who controls what.
It was a polite way of saying, stop the infighting. The war was over. The Soviets were the new enemy, and America needed a plan.
The fight over military roles.
The stakes couldn't have been higher. World War II had ended just 3 years earlier, and now the services were battling over bureaucracy. The Air Force, freshly carved out of the Army in 1947, wanted exclusive control over air operations, strategic bombing, and nuclear weapons. Furious at the idea of losing its aircraft carriers, the Navy fought to keep its fleet air arm. The Marine Corps wanted no part of being absorbed into the Army. The Army, which had spent the war defining large-scale land combat, was now struggling for relevance in a world obsessed with air power and nuclear bombs.
Mr. Secretary, how do you want to handle this?
The Air Force will control strategic bombing and nuclear weapons delivery. The Navy retains control of aircraft carriers and fleet operations. The Army's role remains ground warfare and land-based air defense. The Marine Corps will not become part of the Army.
Forrestal had one goal. He intended to divide responsibilities before the inter-service feuding weakened America's military effectiveness. This was the compromise. The Navy kept its carriers and agreed not to pursue its own strategic Air Force. The Air Force agreed not to pursue carrier aviation. Everyone agreed the Marine Corps would not become a part of the Army. All the services had vital peacetime tasks except the largest. The Air Force would operate the nation's global strike weapons and stand watch over the homeland. The Navy would protect shipping lanes. The Marine Corps would project decisive combat power within days of notification. The Army, the largest service and used to special treatment, was left wondering whether its traditional role would fade away. And yet, the agreement set the foundation for American defense spending for generations. Instead of reducing redundancy, it baked in inter-service rivalry. Instead of cutting costs, it ensured every branch would fight to justify its share of the budget. And over the next few years, that fight would escalate and become public. While the generals and admirals were busy carving up the military's future, another war was brewing. In Asia.
The Forgotten Warning, Korea, 1949.
The Korean peninsula was spiraling toward war a year after the Key West Agreement. The U.S. had withdrawn most of its forces from South Korea, assuming that a small advisory mission would be enough to keep order. In Washington, the focus was shifting toward nuclear weapons and strategic deterrence. Ground forces and conventional war were yesterday's thinking. The real threat was the Soviet Union and its growing atomic arsenal. To make the matter more urgent, the Soviets conducted their first successful test of a nuclear weapon in August 1949. The West had lost its dominance. Then, in January 1950, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson defined America's vital security interests in the Pacific. He excluded Korea from that list, but by the time Washington realized Korea wasn't just another skirmish, it was too late. A Soviet-backed North Korea invaded the South on June 25, 1950, launching a war that the U.S. wasn't prepared for. And this is where General Matthew Ridgway enters the picture. He was the man who would change America's military spending forever.
Ridgway's War, 1950.
December 1950. The war was going badly. U.S. and UN forces were retreating. The Chinese had entered the war, pushing American troops into a brutal winter retreat. Morale had collapsed. Soldiers were exhausted. Supplies were low. The U.S. commander had been killed in a traffic incident. Amidst the turmoil, the Army chose a new commander, Matthew Ridgway. During World War II, Ridgway commanded the 82nd Airborne Division at Normandy and the 18th Airborne Corps during the Ardennes Offensive. Upon taking command, Ridgway assessed the situation. He stated,
"The men I met along the road, those I stopped to talk to, all conveyed to me a conviction that this was a bewildered army, not sure of itself or its leaders, not sure what they were doing there. The leadership I found in many instances sadly lacking, and I said so."
Many wondered whether America would leave. This list ranged from South Korean national leadership to soldiers on the ground. Ridgway expressed his intent and stated,
"I've come to stay."
Ridgway took over the 8th Army after General Walton Walker's death and immediately changed everything. He re-energized the troops, stopped the retreat, and launched a counteroffensive. By early 1951, he had stabilized the front and turned the tide. The Forgotten War would end in a stalemate rather than a decisive loss. But his biggest impact wasn't just on the battlefield. It was what he did after the war.
The birth of permanent military spending.
After Korea, Ridgway became Chief of Staff of the Army. And this is where he made his mark. Not with a rifle, but with politics. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, himself a former Army officer who led the Allies to victory in Europe, aimed to balance military commitments with economic sustainability. He knew that without military drawdown, America would run deficits due to military funding. He intended to cut the Army and shift spending toward the other services and the global strike weapons that defend America's homeland. He sought troop reductions in Europe and intended to share defense responsibilities with NATO allies. Eisenhower stated,
Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed."
Eisenhower warned against the establishment of a military-industrial complex. Ridgway publicly fought back. He argued the U.S. needed permanent large ground forces to handle conflicts like Korea. He testified before Congress, pushing back against budget cuts and warning against over-reliance on nuclear deterrence. Ridgway won out. Presented with two conflicting arguments, Congress did what it does best. It gridlocked. The Army didn't shrink. Military budgets remained high. and America locked itself into a cycle of permanent defense spending. This defense spending premise continues today. People like to say the U.S. spends so much on defense because we have to fight 2 wars at once or project power. That's wrong. Those policies were the result of high defense spending, not the cause. The real reason was that Matthew Ridgway and others like him made sure each military service had a justification for more funding, even when nuclear deterrence made massive peacetime ground forces unnecessary. And that's the story of why we spend so much on defense. 75 years later, America is still locked into this model. But what happens when the world changes and we don't?
Fast forward to today. Our high defense spending had an unintended consequence. America had such a large defense capability that some partner nations chose to put less effort into theirs. Now, America wants NATO and Europe to spend more to contribute to their own defense. This is an echo of President Eisenhower in the 1950s. And despite the fact that NATO has only once activated the Joint Defense Act, and that was to come to the aid of the United States in Afghanistan, some call for us to leave NATO. But in a twist that defies logic, those who call for America to reduce our commitment to partner nations still call for us to maintain high defense spending. These two positions contradict. One valid position would be to strengthen the economic footing of every American and reduce the burden of debt on future generations. One generation has no right to bind another generation with debt. The dead have no rights over the living. This position would acknowledge that we must reduce defense spending during peacetime. A result of this position would be reduced support for partner nations, requiring our partners to increase their capability. A countering valid position would be to maintain our high defense commitment to our partner nations. Security, economics, and influence are all tied together. This position would acknowledge that if America will be great, we need to maintain global leadership. We must act alone and with partner nations to create favorable conditions and gain and maintain freedom of action and influence. Nations form and maintain coalitions and international partnerships not out of altruism, but as a strategic effort to enhance their own strength, stability, and interests. But threatening and divorcing our long-term partners while still increasing debt for future generations is both unsound and unwise. Is a country that burdens its future generations with debt while weakening its alliances making itself great again? May God bless the United States of America.